What actually happens to the very last families in Greenland? Well, the truth is, we don't know. All of these factors I've mentioned came together to create the perfect storm that brought down their civilization bit by bit during the 14th and 15th century.
For 500 years, we believed the Greenland Vikings were a cautionary tale of failure, a people who starved in the cold because they were too stubborn to change. We imagined frozen bodies in empty settlements, the last survivors waiting for a rescue that never came. But modern DNA has just shattered that myth. The bones tell a different story. They didn't die out, and they didn't disappear into thin air. In fact, they may have never truly left us at all. The three lost settlers. First, we look at what happens when modern genetics meets ancient bones. For decades, the story of the Norse in Greenland ended in a graveyard. Historians painted a bleak picture, the eastern settlement falling into a silent, icy tomb with the last few survivors huddled together as the Inuit closed in or the frost took hold. It was a narrative of extinction. But when scientists finally managed to pull DNA from the remains of these lost settlers, the genetic code didn't scream massacre or starvation. Instead, it whispered something much more practical: departure. The revelation that they never left comes from a massive shift in how we interpret archaeological sites. For a long time, the absence of people was seen as proof of death. But genomic researchers began looking at the Scandinavian gene pool and the specific markers found in the Greenlandic remains. What they found was a lack of genetic stress. Usually, when a population is dying out and isolated, you see a bottleneck. The DNA becomes less diverse, and signs of inbreeding or extreme physical stress show up in the skeletal record. The Greenlandic Norse, however, remained genetically healthy and robust right up until the moment the settlements were abandoned. Their DNA didn't look like a group of people facing a biological dead end. It looked like a group that was still very much part of a larger, mobile world. So, where did they go? The truth exposed by the DNA is that these people didn't vanish into the Greenlandic soil. They trickled back into the European North Atlantic. They moved back to Iceland and Norway, integrating so seamlessly into those populations that their specific Greenlandic signature became part of the broader Scandinavian family tree. They didn't leave the world, they just left the island. This is why the Lost Viking mystery is being reframed as one of the greatest migration stories in history. Think about the empty room theory that archaeologists are now using to support this genetic data. If you were an archaeologist digging up a house where everyone had died of a plague or a sudden famine, you would find valuables: iron tools, precious loom weights, religious icons, and sturdy cooking pots. Iron was incredibly expensive in the Middle Ages. You wouldn't just leave it behind. Yet when we excavate the last Norse farms in Greenland, we find nothing. The houses are stripped clean. The church bells are missing. The valuable iron rivets are gone. This clean sweep of the settlements matches the DNA evidence perfectly. People who are dying of hunger don't spend their last calories carefully dismantling their looms and packing their best clothes for a sea voyage. The DNA tells us they were healthy enough to travel, and the empty houses tell us they had the time to pack. They weren't missing, they were relocating. They traded their failing farms for a new life back east, carrying their genetic legacy with them. The reason we couldn't find the truth for 5 centuries is that we were looking for a massacre in the dirt when we should have been looking for a passenger list. The Norse didn't succumb to the Arctic, they did something much more human. They checked their bank accounts, looked at the horizon, and decided it was time to go home. But if they were healthy and thriving enough to plan an orderly exit, what was the primary engine that kept them there for so long? The Ivory Empire. To truly grasp why the Norse clung to the edge of the habitable world for nearly half a millennium, we have to look past the image of the humble, struggling farmer. For years, history books treated the Greenlanders like misplaced peasants trying to grow hay in a freezer. But DNA analysis of a very different kind, this time from animal remains, has revealed that the Greenland colony wasn't just a remote outpost, it was the headquarters of a global luxury monopoly. The Norse weren't just there to survive, they were there to get rich. They were the primary suppliers for one of the most lucrative markets in the medieval world, walrus ivory. In a recent groundbreaking study, researchers performed genomic fingerprinting on walrus tusks and ivory fragments found in museums and cathedrals across Europe, from London to Kiev. They were looking for the source of this white gold. The results were staggering. During the height of the Middle Ages, almost 100% of the ivory circulating in Europe came from a very specific lineage of walrus found only in the waters around Greenland. This means the Greenland Norse had a near-total monopoly on the ivory trade. They were essentially the medieval equivalent of an oil-rich nation, controlling a resource that the European elite craved for their crucifixes, chess pieces, and jewelry. The DNA didn't just tell us where the ivory came from, it told us how hard the Norse were working to get it. By analyzing the genetic diversity of the walrus remains, scientists discovered a shift over time. In the early days of the colony, the Norse were hunting walruses close to home, but as the centuries passed, the DNA markers showed they were traveling further and further north into the treacherous waters of Disco Bay, over 500 miles away from their main settlements. This was an industrial-scale operation. They were navigating iceberg-choked waters in open boats, hunting massive, dangerous bulls, and processing the tusks on site just to satisfy the fashion demands of Paris and Rome. This ivory trade was the lifeline of the colony. It was the currency they used to buy the things Greenland didn't have: iron for tools, timber for ships, and grain for bread. The DNA of these tusks proves that the Norse were deeply integrated into a global economic network. They weren't isolated or forgotten. They were essential. However, this high-stakes trade also created a dangerous dependency. When the DNA from later tusks shows them hunting smaller female walruses, it suggests that they were over-harvesting their primary resource. They were pushing the limits of the natural world to keep their economy afloat. The story of the missing Vikings is often told as one of ecological failure, but the ivory DNA suggests it was a market collapse. In the 14th century, African elephant ivory began to flood back into European markets as trade routes opened up. Elephant ivory is easier to carve and was seen as superior to walrus ivory. Almost overnight, the value of the Greenlanders' main export plummeted. They were left with a high-maintenance colony and a product that nobody wanted to buy anymore. They didn't just lose their way of life, they lost their business model. But even with the ivory market crashing, how did they manage to stay so physically healthy and well-fed on an island that was slowly freezing over? Dietary shapeshifters. For decades, the most popular explanation for the disappearance of the Norse was their supposed cultural stubbornness. The narrative went like this: the Vikings arrived in Greenland as cattle farmers, and even as the climate plummeted into the Little Ice Age, they refused to stop acting like European lords. We were told they sat in their drafty stone halls, clutching their prayer books and dreaming of beef, while they slowly starved to death because they looked down on the pagan Inuit ways of hunting seals. It was a story of pride coming before a very literal fall. However, when scientists applied carbon and nitrogen isotope analysis to the actual skeletons of these people, that entire theory evaporated. Isotope analysis is a bit like a chemical diary stored in your bones. The food you eat leaves a permanent signature in your skeletal structure. If you eat land-based animals, like cows and goats, your bones will show one chemical profile. If you eat seafood, they show another. When researchers tested the remains of Norse settlers from the early 11th century, the results were exactly what you'd expect. Their diet was about 20% marine-based. They were indeed farmers, who supplemented their meals with the occasional fish or seal. They were trying to replicate the lifestyle of their Norwegian ancestors. But then the scientists tested the skeletons from the 14th and 15th centuries, the very people who were supposedly starving because of their refusal to adapt. The data was shocking. By the end of the colony's life, the Norse diet had shifted to nearly 80% marine-based food. This was a total dietary revolution. They hadn't stubbornly clung to their cows. They had transformed themselves into master maritime hunters. They were eating massive amounts of seal, particularly the harp seal and hooded seal, which migrated along the coast. This chemical evidence proves that the Norse were incredibly resilient. They didn't ignore the environment around them, they embraced it. They learned the migratory patterns of the sea mammals, they adapted their hunting techniques, and they successfully fed their families for generations after the climate made traditional farming impossible. The stubborn Viking is a myth. The reality is a population of adaptive survivors who managed to thrive in an increasingly Arctic environment. In fact, the health of these late-period settlers was remarkably good. Their bones don't show the telltale grooves of childhood malnutrition or the porous markers of scurvy that you would expect from a dying, starving population. They were tall, strong, and well-nourished on a diet of seal meat and fish. They had mastered Greenland. They had become a people of the sea, perfectly tuned to the rhythms of the North Atlantic. They were doing everything right to survive the cold. But if they were such successful hunters and had adapted so well to the changing food supply, what was the one thing they couldn't adapt to? The invisible force that was literally pulling the ground out from under their feet. The sinking shorelines. While the collapse of the ivory market and the cooling climate were massive blows, a new discovery in 2023 has revealed a much more literal reason why the Norse abandoned their homes. For years, we assumed that as the Little Ice Age took hold, the sea level must have dropped because so much water was being locked up in growing glaciers. But in Greenland, the opposite happened. Due to a complex geological phenomenon known as glacial isostatic adjustment, the Norse weren't just dealing with colder winters, they were watching the ocean slowly swallow their world. The physics behind this are fascinating and somewhat counterintuitive. As the massive Greenland ice sheet grew thicker and heavier during the cooling centuries, its sheer weight began to push the Earth's crust downward. It's like sitting on a foam mattress. The area directly under the weight sinks. At the same time, the massive mass of all that new ice exerted its own gravitational pull on the surrounding ocean, literally dragging the sea toward the coast. While the rest of the world might have seen sea levels stabilize, the Norse settlements in Greenland were hit with a double whammy. The land was sinking and the water was rising. New geophysical modeling has shown that the coastline shifted by hundreds of meters. For a society that built its most valuable infrastructure on the narrow, flat strips of land between the mountains and the fjords, this was catastrophic. This wasn't a sudden tsunami, it was a slow, relentless, creeping flood. Year by year, the high tide mark moved closer to the barn doors. The best meadows, the ones used for the hay that kept their livestock alive through the winter, became increasingly salty and eventually turned into marshland. Archaeologists have recently used these models to look at the ruins of the eastern settlement, and the results are haunting. Some of the most important Norse farms are now partially underwater or sits right on the edge of the waves. By the time the colony was abandoned, it's estimated that the sea had risen by as much as 10 feet in certain areas. This meant that even if the Norse were perfect hunters and adaptable survivors, their foundational home base was disappearing. You can't maintain a permanent settlement if your graveyard, your church, and your pastures are being reclaimed by the North Atlantic. This sinking landscape changed the psychology of the colony. It turned a struggle for survival into a losing battle against the elements. It's one thing to endure a cold winter, it's another to watch the sea flood your ancestors' graves and turn your hayfields into salt flats. The Norse were masters of the sea, but they couldn't stop the ocean from rising. The land itself was telling them that their time on this island was coming to an end. With their fields underwater and their primary source of wealth gone, the Norse finally reached the breaking point where staying was no longer a sign of strength, but a lack of common sense. The Great Quiet Exit. When we imagine the end of a civilization, our minds tend to drift toward Hollywood imagery, flickering torches, desperate battles, and a final tragic stand against an encroaching enemy. For centuries, this is exactly how we framed the Norse exit from Greenland. We assumed there must have been a final day, a moment of total collapse where the last ship sailed away or the last settler fell. But the archaeological record tells a story that is far more mundane and, in many ways, far more impressive. It wasn't a chaotic flight for survival. It was a planned, orderly, and quiet migration home. If the Norse had been wiped out by a sudden catastrophe, the frozen in-time ruins would look like Pompeii. We would find tables set for meals, chests full of precious belongings, and iron tools left where they fell. Iron was the most precious commodity in the North Atlantic. Leaving behind a high-quality axe or a set of nails would have been unthinkable for a struggling survivor. Yet when we look at the late-period farms in the eastern settlement, we see something remarkable. They are empty. The settlers didn't just leave, they moved out. They took the door hinges. They took the church bells. They dismantled the looms and packed up the iron rivets from their boats. They even seem to have taken their livestock with them or slaughtered them for the journey. The absence of stuff is the most profound evidence we have for an orderly departure. It suggests a community that sat down, looked at their flooded fields and their worthless ivory tusks, and collectively decided to close up shop. This wasn't a collapse in the traditional sense. It was a strategic withdrawal. This transition likely took place over several decades, perhaps even a generation. Younger Norsemen, seeing more opportunities in Iceland or the growing trade hubs of Norway, likely left first. As the population thinned out, the remaining elders would have eventually realized that there weren't enough hands left to maintain the complex irrigation systems or man the massive walrus hunting expeditions. The Great Quiet Exit was a series of small, individual choices that eventually led to the last boat being loaded. The DNA evidence we discussed earlier backs this up. By re-entering the Scandinavian gene pool, these missing Vikings didn't disappear. They simply changed their address. They integrated back into the families of their cousins in the East, bringing their stories and their skills with them. They were absorbed so thoroughly that we lost track of them in the history books, but they never left the human story. So, if the evidence of an orderly departure has been sitting in the dirt all along, why did we spend 5 centuries obsessed with the idea that they all died? What's the truth and what's not? The mystery of Greenland's missing Vikings has persisted for 500 years, not because the evidence was missing, but because the truth didn't fit the story we wanted to tell. For centuries, we preferred the version where they perished, a morality tale about European pride and the failure to respect the power of nature. It felt like a tidy lesson in human fallibility. But as we have seen, through the lens of modern DNA and climate science, that narrative was more of a reflection of our own fears than a record of their reality. The Norse of Greenland were not the victims of their own stubbornness. They were sophisticated, adaptive, and globalized people who managed to hold on to a frozen frontier for longer than the United States has currently been a nation. They didn't fail to survive. They succeeded in surviving until the cost of staying simply outweighed the benefit of leaving. When the ivory market crashed and the very land began to sink beneath their feet, they didn't wait for the end. They chose a new beginning. By following the genetic trail, we can finally retire the image of the lost settler. These people didn't vanish into the mist. They walked back into the mainstream of history, merging their DNA with the populations of Iceland, Norway, and Denmark. They are the ancestors of millions of people living today. The truth exposed by the DNA is that the Greenland experiment didn't end in a grave. It ended in a relocation. They never truly left us because they became us. Their story isn't one of extinction, but of the ultimate human superpower, the ability to recognize when it's time to pack up, move on, and start again. If this story changed how you see history, subscribe for more deep dives into the world's greatest mysteries.